Hey, this is Christian with Forest of Art and Healing Arts, and this is the first of two videos on the question of kindness. So the statement from the Yoga Bear that we're working with this week, or these couple of weeks, is make kindness the currency. And to discuss this, I'm going to be going into and developing some somatic theory. And this is a place where somatic theory and critical theory come together. I also work in critical theory in the other part of my life, and I'm going to start to bring these two together. For ages, philosophers have been looking for a logic of kindness. How do we derive kindness from our philosophy? How can we get along? Or are we condemned to fight it out for the rest of human history? The 4th century BCE Greek philosopher Aristotle developed a set of ethical ideas based upon his notion of the final good. The final good is something that is desirable in itself and is pursued for its own sake. In this category, Aristotle placed our desire to be happy, or using Aristotle's word, eudaimonia, which means flourishing or living well. He applied this notion then of the final good for its own sake to friendships. The perfect friendship is one based not on utility, but on goodness, in which we see others as second selves. We love them as we love ourselves. Interestingly, and let's keep this in mind for the second part of the series on kindness, Aristotle did not consider money to be good, because money is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. Hence, relating to each other through the currency of money is not good friendship. Could we even say that it is not kind? There's a scene in Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, where a Christian merchant asks a Jewish moneylender for a loan. The Jew reminds the Christian that he spat on him for being a Jew and called him a dog many times, and now he wants to borrow money? The Christian replies with an allusion to Aristotle's critique of money. He says to the Jew, I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee. If thou wilt lend this money, lend it not as to thy friends. For when did friendship take a breed of barren metal of its friend? But lend it rather to thine enemy, who, if he break, thou mayest with better face exact the penalty. The moneylender responds, telling the merchant to calm down. He'll give him a kind offer. He will show kindness. And he sets the bond of forfeiture to be a pound of the merchant's flesh from wherever the moneylender decides to take it. In this scene, Shakespeare is registering the shock of the new money economy that was developing in his time, an economy that Aristotle would have deemed not to be for the human good. Now, in the 18th century, Immanuel Kant derived a set of ethics sourced from his notion of the categorical imperative, which goes like this. Act so that you use humanity in your person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. And then, act so that the maxim of your will could always hold at the same time as a principle in the giving of a universal law. End quote. If the way that you act is applied as a universal law, then it will be applied to you as well. So you need to choose well how you act. Treat others well, and through this universal law, you will also be treated well. Now, Kant understood this to be unreachable. So he suggested that we strive for it, even if we never get there. In the first quarter of the 19th century, Georg Hegel's Dialectical Idealism, we have the relationship of the self and the other rooted in his philosophical logic. And it goes like this. Follow each step. Being is determined when it is negated by nothing. Being then in turn negates nothing and becomes something. So, something is only something because it is not nothing. Any something, including human selfhood, carries its other, its opposite, in its very definition. And it wants to exclude this otherness once it has established itself as a something, because the presence of otherness at its core maintains a fundamental instability in the surety of itself. It is itself and simultaneously not itself. Now, this may remind you of some of what I was talking about in a past video on how the otherness of the health practices we do, bodywork, yoga, movement work, make us aware of ourselves through its otherness. Hegel's entire method, including his natural science, his aesthetics, and his ethics, spring from this philosophical logic, the recognition of otherness in the self. Now, considered in both directions, both the self and the other recognize each other. This is called mutual recognition. And some theorists have derived a set of Hegelian ethics from it. In this ethic, kindness springs from this fundamental awareness of the other. Or if we follow Hegel himself in his philosophy of right, Unrecht, not right, is a source of unkindness that springs from following one's own personal will without consideration for others. Now, this is negated by entering into groupings with these others. For example, falling in love and building a family negates the selfish will of the individual through the needs of the members of the family. But now the individual family has a will that needs to be negated so as not to become unrecht. And that is achieved through working in a field, working with others, or in a corporation, as Hegel calls it. This negates the individual family's wills through the needs of the others in the group. Then this group ends up having a will of its own. This segment of society is then negated by the state, of which everyone is a citizen. Now, unfortunately, Hegel leaves it all up to the state at the end. One of the most unkind institutions in history. This is a hopelessly unrealistic Enlightenment project to think that citizenship in a state will check unkindness. Notice that all of these ethical systems I've been talking about so far, these checks against unkindness, are all based in the mind. They begin from abstractions and then are meant to be put into practice. These are cognitive tasks, and they are as limited as the cognitive psychology that's so popular today. Karl Marx turned Hegel's philosophy around and placed it on its feet. As a system that arose from abstraction, Hegel's philosophy was standing on its head, in Marx's words. Marx instead developed an ethic based upon the material needs of humans and the labor they exert to satisfy those needs. So Marx brought the debate down into the human body in society. I'm not going to discuss the Marxist system here. I do that in my other scholarship, in literary and critical theory. But I want to follow his lead into the body and see if we can find a praxis of kindness that arises from somatic theory, from the health practices I've been talking about in my recent videos, bodywork, yoga, movement work. Before I do that, let me mention that religion also teaches an ethical system, a way of being kind. Let's just take Christianity, for example. In John 13:34 and 15:12, Jesus commands his disciples, and by extension all Christians, to love one another as Jesus loved them. Now this is a triangulation of the self and the other with God. Both the self and the other are creations of God. And if they realize that and abide in God, then they will treat each other with kindness, as God treats each of them. But as a triangulation, it causes a degree of alienation to the direct relationship between people. They are not kind to each other because they see the human in each other, but because God commands them to. What happens when one person's faith wavers, or even ends altogether? What if the other person follows a different religion? Well, we can look at the history of war to answer that question. And this kindness is based on an emotional belief, faith. which Freud understood to be childishness. It is not based on the intellect, as philosophy is. What happens when people begin to critique their blind faith, their obedient faith? And what happens when they come to realize that there is no God? Will they still be kind to each other? If we look over to Hinduism, the religion upon which yoga is rooted, or Buddhism, we find the notion of ahimsa, which more or less means non-violence or no harming. It is taught in the ancient Vedic text and is mentioned in the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. Now, I'm no scholar of Hinduism or Buddhism, but it seems to me that the emphasis on ahimsa is more on taking a vow of self-control to cause no violence than on developing empathy for the other. It is more an act of obedience than an act of mutual love. And it is also based on a relationship to a fictional God character. In fact, the spiritual side of yoga is a practice of uniting oneself, or yoking, the word yoga, with God. Or, alternatively, realizing that God is in you, or that you are God, depending on which guru is speaking. So yoga is also a faith-based practice, and its command to be kind arises from this faith. What happens when that faith breaks? We need a more materialist reason to be kind. Something based in a condition that we all have. And no matter what happens in history, what catastrophes we create, peak oil, climate change, the failure of civil society, or all-out world war, we will only realize more and more that we have this condition. And the condition I'm talking about is that we are all encased in a physical body, this mortal coil that Hamlet speaks about. We are all born, live, and die. And during that time, however long it is, we all experience pain, pleasure, itching, soreness, illness, and healing. We are all bodies, somas. How can we derive kindness from this universal condition? Let's return to the Yoga Bear's first two statements. Awareness is the zone, and inhabit your body. Awareness has a spatial component. As we more fully inhabit our bodies, we become aware of more information coming from our body. This is called kinesthesis. And as I discussed in my first videos, we develop this through practices that work with our bodies. Body work, movement work. Through these practices, we can also become aware of how things repressed in our unconscious develop and determine our body and its place in space. Remember that video I made on the unconscious. And as we become more and more aware of our body and its place in our society, we can become aware of how social systems work to alienate us from our bodies. We can literally find the unkindness of our society as it oppresses our bodies. And we feel this in concentric circles extending out from ourselves. Becoming aware of our family systems, our neighborhood, our workplace, our nation, etc. With practice, we can spatially expand this reach of our awareness. And as we do that, we come across something else in our field of awareness. The other people. And their bodies in space and place. At first, it may be that we sense them only as they affect our space, as we did when we were infants, first developing ourself. Some other that was at our skin boundary, feeding, cleaning, cooing. But then we feel the relationship between us. We can become aware of what other people experience. We can feel how our unkindness affects them. We can feel how the systems in which we live, capitalism, patriarchy, are fundamentally set up to place ourself and that other person in competition with each other, in a state of constant and competitive unkindness. From the yoga mat, say, deepening our awareness, we go out into the world, we maintain our awareness, and we enter into this state of radical inhabitation of the social body. As we do that to a greater width in our social circles and to a greater depth in people, That is to say, we can become aware of things in people that even they are not aware of in themselves. As we do this, we develop empathy. Empathy is to be aware of what others experience as they experience themselves, and even to become aware of what they have repressed in themselves. This is arriving at the point from the opposite direction from what Marx developed in his method, which begins from the society of laboring bodies. If we were to situate this discussion in the two sides of the 1960s movements, Marx's direction was the concern of the New Left. What I'm talking about in this video was the concern of the hippies. The Marxists never went far enough into kindness, and they ended up developing radical but alienated and brutal social systems. Stalinism, Stasi, and in the West, the ever-splintering communist parties. The hippies did not go far enough into society, and some of them ended up developing the New Age movement, a collection of sometimes well-meaning but illogical, mystified, quasi-religious movements and practices, including bodywork and yoga. Note that some of these practices, as they developed in the New Age movement, function as a displacement of our awareness. The faux spiritual awareness, usually lacking in the discipline of actual religious people. The meditation beads for show. Tarot cards, which used to be a social game, like a board game in Europe, but is now marketed as a service, for which someone who ostensibly skilled in awareness and the meaning of the cards charges money. These psychics, these charlatans, function as a displacement of what we could really become aware of. Similarly, past lives, Akashic records, notions of the universe as an actor in our lives, replacing God as the prime actor, and of course, also notions of intervening divine characters, are all displacements, binding our real anxiety into faux solutions. All of this displaces our awareness of our material body and our social relations. People escape the brutal and unkind world into a storyland of kind and knowing gods or a universe that will take care of them. Of course, all this is being marketed to the corporate world now and raking in the big money. Circulation of faux kindness for dollar bills. The next question is, are we allowed to be aware? And to what degree are we allowed to be aware? Or put another way, how far into the space of somatic and social awareness are we allowed to proceed? And what is the function of forbidding or denying our awareness? What is the function of censorship? We see it today in the killing and imprisonment of journalists, in the banning and burning of books, and even, ironically, in the proscription of language by some identity politics movements, movements whose goal is liberation, but whose practice sometimes ends up squashing awareness. In whose interest is awareness proscribed? Who benefits from our unconsciousness? Obviously, the people in power do. Instead, if we work on developing and sustaining awareness, awareness that leads to empathy. Empathy for the self, for the unlistened to self, for the blind spots in the body, and empathy for others. Empathy for our shared mutual experience. Then we find ourselves in the following situation. If we can feel what others feel, then we can feel their pain. And if we are the cause of their pain, then we get an immediate and urgent feedback in our awareness about how we are treating them. And if, as Aristotle holds, we seek happiness as the final end, or as Freud holds, our primary drive is a pleasure principle, a life drive, with the death drive being a secondary principle that results from frustration of the pleasure principle. And if we stay in the zone of awareness through awareness-building practices, yoga, bodywork, movement work, and there are many others, then we must be kind. For only kindness will satisfy our life drive in the field of awareness. Only kindness serves as the final good. Here we have a somatic-based categorical imperative, a mutual recognition rooted in the body and mind. And as you develop this somatically sourced empathy for others with whom you come into contact, friends, family, colleague, you also develop an empathy for others that you see in your community. For example, when you see homelessness in your community, and you are living in the zone of awareness and inhabiting your body, how long will you tolerate this? How long will you tolerate experiencing the body of another person in the gutter? Cold, hungry, infected, in pain, at risk. Not for long if you don't deny your awareness. Now, let's extend this out to events you hear about in the news. When I was a student at UCLA in the 80s, I learned about apartheid in South Africa. I learned about how black Africans were treated. It became intolerable. I could not do nothing. And so I became a political activist. Today, there are many similar situations in the world. Many people are forcefully taken from their homes, their lands destroyed, their culture annihilated, and they are treated with brutality. From the vantage point of, say, your yoga mat, in the zone of awareness, inhabiting your body, aware and inhabiting also the otherness in you that formed you in the first place, empathic for yourself and for the others, could you tolerate people being oppressed in the world? Could you tolerate bodies placed in pain, hunger, cold, fear, torture? What does your body and mind want to do about this? This is the question I want to ask. Can we develop a practice of kindness from our practices of healthy living in awareness? But this is still only looking at the individual. In the second video in the series on kindness, I will look at the issue of circulation, of currency, of how we live with others. What circulates in our society currently is rarely kindness.